This is Dr. James Spiegel in his teaching on the philosophy of religion. This is session number 4, Theistic Arguments, Part 3, Ontological Argument.
Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to another theistic argument known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. It was devised by St. Anselm in the 11th century, and this argument's unique. It's an a priori argument. It's an argument for the existence of God which does not appeal to anything in sense experience like the other arguments for the existence of God. This one just begins with the concept of God as a perfect being, as a being that is the greatest being that we can conceive of. And according to Anselm and other defenders of the argument since, this can provide sufficient grounds for believing that such a being exists. Versions of the ontological argument have been defended by lots of other philosophers, from René Descartes to 20th century philosophers such as Norman Malcolm, Charles Hartshorne, and Alvin Plantinga. We'll look at Anselm's original version of the argument, or two versions of the argument that he devised, and then we'll look at Plantinga's modal version of the ontological argument as well. So Anselm, he was a very pious man who became convinced that the existence of God could be known and even proven just by mere reflection on the idea of God. And it was something that he had a kind of intuition about long before he actually devised the argument itself, that that such an argument should be possible. So eventually he developed this argument, and it's presented in two different forms in a work of his called the Proslogium. So he begins with the idea, as he puts it, of that than which none greater can be conceived, a being than which nothing greater can be thought. So let's call that being G for short, a being than which none greater can be conceived. The second premise of the argument is that which exists in reality, and not only in my mind, is greater than that which exists only in my mind. After all, if somebody offered you these options to have a pizza that is just the thought of a pizza, a concept of, say, your favorite pizza, deep dish, pepperoni, and sausage, or whatever you like on your pizza, but just the thought of it, as opposed to an actual pizza that was just purchased at, say, Pizza Hut. Which would you choose if you were really hungry? You're going to go with the actual pizza. Why? Because it's real. The actual pizza is greater than the mere thought of the pizza, no matter how lofty your thoughts or dreams are of the ideal pizza. It's better to have the real thing, the reality. When you're talking about, good things, the reality is always greater than the concept, the mere idea. So that which exists in reality is greater than that which exists only in one's mind. Now, if G, or that than which none greater can be thought, existed only in my mind, then it would not be that than which none greater can be thought. Because I can conceive of that being, that greatest possible being, existing in reality and not just in my mind. So the idea of God, or that than which none greater can be thought, we must be talking about a being that actually exists. if we're truly trying to conceive of a being that is the greatest conceivable being, because it's greater to exist in reality than just in the mind, than this being that I'm conceiving of. Even if I'm an atheist or an agnostic, I have to admit, according to Anselm, that this being exists in reality as well, if I'm really thinking consistently about a being than which none greater can be conceived. So, in order to avoid a contradiction, I need to admit that this being exists in reality. It would be contradictory for me to say this is the greatest conceivable being, it has all these perfections, and yet it doesn't exist. Because to exist is a perfection. If I'm conceiving of this being consistently, I have to admit it exists in reality, because to exist in reality is a perfection. It's a great-making quality. So, the conclusion is that than which none greater can be conceived must exist in reality. God exists. Okay? He's proceeding with the assumption that God is that being than which none greater can be conceived. So that's the first version of the ontological argument. Now he has another argument, or another form of the ontological argument that is a little bit different, and it begins with the premise that it's possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. So, Anselm would ask you, can you imagine a being whose non-existence is inconceivable? Or as Wallace Shawn in the great film The Princess Bride would say with his lateral lisp, inconceivable. It would be inconceivable to have a being whose non-existence is possible. If it's a greatest being, the greatest possible being would have to be such that its non-existence would be inconceivable. Can you imagine such a being whose non-existence cannot be imagined? Anselm's assuming that, yeah, you can imagine that, a being whose non-existence is inconceivable. Well, the next question then is, does that being exist? Is there a being which answers to that description, is a being whose non-existence is inconceivable? A being which cannot be conceived not to exist. Does that being exist in reality? Now, if you've already admitted that you can conceive of that being, then that is to say you believe it's possible. Now the question is, do you believe it actually exists? If you say yes, then okay, well then you've admitted that theism is true. If you say no, you've contradicted yourself. Because you've just told me that you believe that a being whose non-existence is inconceivable does not exist, which means you're conceiving this being as not existing. You just told me that it's a being such that you cannot conceive of its non-existence. So you can't have it both ways. If you're thinking about a being whose non-existence is inconceivable, then you have to say, no, it must exist because I've just admitted that its non-existence is something that can't even be conceived. And if it can't be conceived, then it's not possible. So this being, G, cannot be conceived as not existing. Therefore, it must exist necessarily. So this is a modal, is so-called modal version of the argument because it has to do with logical necessity, that this being necessarily exists. It cannot not exist. So that's the other version of Anselm's argument, the so-called ontological argument. Anselm didn't name it. Kant named it. Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, he also named the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, and he named this the ontological argument. What are we to say to Anselm's argument, or arguments. There was a contemporary of Anselm named Gonolo who tried to rebut Anselm's argument, and in doing so, he used the analogy of the perfect island, right? I can imagine a perfect island with all the things that you want on, a tropical island. And you've got clear, clean water, a nice beach, you've got palm trees, just enough shade, got tropical fruits, right? Coconuts, pineapples, the temperature, say, mid to high 70s, maybe 80s, maybe partly cloudy every day, and lots of fellowship with wonderful people on the island. We can go on and on about what a great island it is. But just because you can imagine this perfect island, doesn't follow from that it actually exists. So that's Gonolo's complaint. Anselm's response is basically to say that, well, his argument doesn't really work with particular kinds of beings. It's only going to work if you're talking about that being than which nothing greater can be conceived, because it's only there that you can get to the conclusion that it must have this additional great-making quality of existence. And so it only works for that being than which none greater can be thought. You can't apply it to particular things like islands or automobiles or pizzas. But that is a bone of contention to this day, right? Critics of the argument insist that no, Gonolo's right. There must be something wrong with the argument, because it seems like you could potentially prove the existence of anything, unicorns or whatever, just by saying that I'm imagining the greatest version of that thing. So there's one objection in Anselm's reply. Another major objection to this argument comes from Kant many centuries later. This is probably the most cited critique of Anselm's argument, and it's Kant's complaint that existence is not a real predicate. It's not the sort of thing that we ascribe to something. Rather, existence is presupposed whenever we predicate, whenever we, say, describe or ascribe qualities to things. So if someone were to ask me to describe a clock on the wall in this particular room, I might say, well, it's a round clock. It has Roman numerals on its face that are symmetrically arranged. It's got a minute hand. It exists. It has a brown rim. It's on the east wall, right? Those are pretty natural descriptions of the thing, except for one thing I said there when I added that it exists. That would seem awkward, right? Because we're taking for granted the existence of the clock that I've been asked to describe. Whenever you are ascribing qualities to things, you're assuming that they exist from the outset. So when we're talking about God, Kant maintains, and describing God, a potential being, if you're an agnostic, as being, say, omnipotent or omniscient, we are kind of assuming it exists, if only for the sake of argument. It's not the sort of thing that you can kind of add to the concept. You're already assuming its existence. Now, a pushback to this criticism is that existence is not always assumed whenever we predicate of things. If I say that Dr. Dolittle loves animals, or Merlin is a magician, or Pegasus flies, unicorns have horns. I'm not assuming these things exist. I'm describing imaginary or fictional objects. So existence, it can be a predicate, right? So I may say that the unicorn has a horn, and actually, in this case, really does exist. I'm adding something to the concept there by talking about a unicorn that I claim is actually real. Why can't I do the same thing when it comes to God? So Anselm and his argument and a couple of objections. In more recent times, we've seen some more sophisticated versions of the ontological argument defended by various philosophers in the 20th century. I mentioned Norman Malcolm. He has a version of the argument. Charles Hartshorne and a number of other process theologians have defended versions of the argument. Alvin Plantinga has devised a modal version of the argument that's gotten a lot of attention that works with possible world analysis. It pivots on the concept of possible worlds and it can be summarized like this. So the first premise, and this is a little bit of simplification of his argument, but I think it captures the essence of his claim here. The first premise is that there's a possible world in which there exists a maximally great being. That is, a being that is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and so on. There's a possible world in which there exists a maximally great being. The second premise is that maximal greatness entails having maximal excellence in every possible world. So to be a maximally great being, a being would have to not just have all of these qualities in certain possible worlds, but would have to have them, would have to exist in all possible worlds, not just some possible worlds. So if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then this being exists in every possible world. Well, guess what? Our world is a possible world. The actual world is a possible world. So if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, if it exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being must exist in this world. If it exists in all possible worlds, this is a possible world, the maximally great being must exist in this possible world. Therefore, there exists a being who is maximally great, who's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and so on. So that's Plantinga's ontological argument. Clearly, the key premise here is that first one, that there is a possible world in which there exists a maximally great being. That is to say, it is possible that a maximally great being could exist in some possible world. And Plantinga takes it as a fair assumption that in order to be a maximally great being, a being would have to exist in every possible world. But that first premise is the key one. That it is possible that there could be a maximally great being. That has been a point of major contention when it comes to discussion of this argument among scholars. Kenneth Hima and others have challenged that first premise, that the concept of a maximally great being, they have argued, is incoherent. C.D. Broad has also brought this up. Jean-Paul Sartre and others have tried to note certain contradictions between divine attributes, or what are understood to be great-making qualities, such as between omnipotence and omniscience. An omnipotent being could make a free being, presumably, right? So let's take that for granted. An omniscient being would know past, present, and future states of all people that it made. But then, in that case, it looks like even an omnipotent being couldn't make a free being if it was also omniscient, because it would know all the future states that are going to happen or occur in the life of this being that he's tried to make free. And if the future states, the future conditions of a particular being were known in advance, then that would imply, arguably, that it wasn't really a free being, because its future states could not be known in advance if it was truly free. That kind of argument has been proposed by various philosophers to try to show that no being could be both omnipotent and omniscient. So you have incompatible divine attributes there. I don't find that particular argument convincing, for one thing, in that case, because I don't share that definition of freedom. Much will pivot or turn on your understanding of what free will is. You would have to hold a particular view on freedom, a particular kind of libertarian view, in order for that argument to work. But who says that particular view of freedom is correct? And that tends to be a problem that plagues different versions of this kind of argument, attempting to show the incoherence of divine attributes, specifically omnipotence and omniscience. Going back to Sartre, among other philosophers who've taken that route. So I would take the view that nobody has shown conclusively, decisively, that there is actual incoherence when it comes to these divine attributes, any of the divine attributes. I don't think that has been proven. So I happen to think that Plantinga's argument is very strong, stronger than Anselm's original argument, but it certainly continues to be food for thought and the subject of a lot of debate in contemporary philosophy of religion, the ontological argument.
This is Dr. James Spiegel in his teaching on the philosophy of religion. This is session number 4, Theistic Arguments, Part 3, Ontological Argument.